Hello, I'm Tom Harper.
And I'm Georgina Brown.
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show,
a podcast about the life and legacy of the legendary adventure writer Wilbur Smith.
In the forward British trenches, they waited below the parapets. With each man in full battle dress, his equipment burden was almost 60 pounds in weight. The thunder of the bursting high explosives rolled away from them, leaving them with dulled senses and singing eardrums. The whistles of the section leaders shrilled along the trenches, and they roused themselves and crowded to the feet of the assault ladders. Then, like an army of khaki lemmings, they swarmed out of their burrows into the open and peered around them dazedly. They were in a transformed and devastated land, so ravaged by the guns that no blade of grass nor twig of tree remained. Only the shattered tree stumps stuck up from the soft, fecal-coloured porridge of mud before them. This dreadful landscape was shrouded in the yellowish fog of burned explosives. "Forward!" the cry passed down the line, and again the whistles trilled and goaded them on. The long Lee-Enfield rifles held out before them, the fixed bayonets aglitter, sinking ankle and knee deep into the soft earth, slipping into the overlapping shell holes and dragging themselves out again, their line bulging and lagging, their horizon limited to a mere 100 paces by swirling, nitrous fog. They trudged forward. Of the enemy trenches they saw no sign. The parapets had been obliterated and flattened. Overhead passed the continuous roar of the barrage, while every few seconds a short shell from their own guns fell into their densely packed lines. "Close up in the centre!" The gaps torn in their ranks by the guns were filled by other amorphous khaki bodies. "Keep the line! Keep the line!" The orders were almost drowned by the tumult of the guns. Then, in the wilderness ahead of them, they saw the glint of metal through the smoke. It was a low wall of metal, interlocking scales of grey steel, like those on the back of a crocodile.
That was a reading by Tom from Wilbur Smith's The Burning Shore, one of the author's novels that takes place during the First World War. For today, we've revisited 4 of Wilbur's books, which have World War I either at the centre or provide the surrounding context for the story. A Sparro Falls, The Burning Shore, Shout at the Devil, and Assegai. To help us, we're joined by Matt Barr, writer, editor, and podcaster. Matt founded and runs the Looking Sideways Action Sports podcast, which one of his listeners described as so very far from the usual action sports angle, it's really the lens we're using to look at life. That, we think, is also what a great novel can do. Matt is a long-time reader of Wilbur Smith's books, and we've invited him here today to talk about them and what draws him to novels telling stories of the First World War, either from land, sea, or air. Welcome, Matt.
Hey, thank you. You've done your research, I can tell.
We try.
Yeah, that was a great introduction. Thank you.
So to start us off, could you tell us how you first heard about Wilbur?
Sure, yeah. The first Wilbur Smith book I actually read was, I can remember it quite well. So it was my first job. I was a Saturday boy for a carpet company in Stratford, Manchester, where I grew up in 1990. And my boss, so I was 14 at that point. My boss had the rack of Wilburs, and we spent a lot of time sat around playing darts and reading. So I picked up a Sparro Falls and started reading it, and he was like, "Wow, no, you got to read them in order." So he started me at the beginning of the Courtney sequence, and yeah, I basically spent every Saturday that I was at that job reading through the whole series. So really interesting to remember that, because obviously that's the kind of memory that I'm 48 now. That's the kind of memory I've not thought about in quite a while. But it was brilliant to revisit the books for this. I think what I remembered was just how much I learned about, obviously they're great adventures, but I didn't really appreciate them as historical fiction when I was a kid, because I was obviously looking at the kind of characters, the adventures, the narratives. But looking back, I mean, yeah, they're really couched in historical reality, aren't they? Which was really interesting to kind of revisit for this.
Yeah, they definitely are, yeah. And you've had quite an adventurous life yourself, which you sort of capture in your podcast, Looking Sideways. So what was behind that podcast?
Well, I've been a journalist my whole life. And I grew up skateboarding, surfing, snowboarding. And to be honest, when I was younger, was quite motivated by doing a lot of that and not really trying to get a proper job. And that, as is often the way, turned into a career. So I ran basically magazines in that world through my 20s. And then for the last 20 years, I've actually run a marketing agency that kind of works with a lot of brands in that world. And the podcast came about, I started doing it 7 years ago now. I think like a lot, at that point I'd been a journalist for like most of my adult life, and I was quite bored of pitching. And I was a fan. I was a podcast fan. I a big avid consumer, and I just kind of thought, well, there wasn't one in my little world. There was a couple, but they weren't very good. And I'm sure it's not an original theme, but there's a tendency in media, as through the digital revolution, let's say, to be quite dumb, to dumb things down, and that in a sphere such as action sports, that's particularly prevalent, as I'm sure you might imagine. And that's not how it's been for me. I was always interested in exploring different themes through my journalism. So yeah, podcasts seemed like a really great vehicle for that. So like a lot of people, started it as a bit of hobby. Been lucky enough to build up a big network over the years of working. So I was able to bring a lot of people in to interview, and it kind of took off, which was obviously really great. So I think I'm 250 episodes in now. And it's led to a lot of different things. Like I've spent the last year working on a documentary, which is kind of related to that world, which has been really challenging and interesting. And I was always quite careful to not to treat it very much as like a passion project and explore the things that interested me. And luckily my audience have gone along with that. So yeah, it's still really fun, and I'm still really enjoying it.
Fantastic. I just have to ask you about the title. What does looking sideways refer to?
Well, it's the stance. So if you stand on obviously there's a clunky old metaphor in there, but if you stand on a skateboard, a snowboard, or a surfboard, you stand sideways on. So you either stand with your left foot forward, which is called regular, or you stand with your right foot forward, which is called goofy. So you don't stand. It's not like skiing where you're like 2 feet forward. So that's just something that everyone that participates in those activities will instinctively understand. And like I say, it's a handy metaphor because it's just a jumping off point in that podcast to explore a lot of the things that I'm interested in: history, art, culture. So worked pretty well.
Do you think that world, the outdoor lifestyle, the action sports, goes hand in hand with being a reader?
I think that there's a rich seam of literature in some areas of it. Like surfing has a really kind of proud literary culture. So yeah, I mean, it seems there's a huge appetite for it. And it was really interesting when I told people that I was doing this, how many people had grown up with Wilbur Smith as well, and like me, had initially seen it as a way into different vistas, different worlds, So yeah, I would say that's the case.
It's great to hear. I think it's easy to think of Wilbur as a writer, but he was an adventurer too. He was a keen skier, he was a diver, he was a pilot, he could fly. So he had all of these kind of adventurous skills going for him, as well as coming back to writing throughout his whole life.
Did he surf though? I'm not sure.
Surfing, I don't think so.
Well, he could have done, because Africa, as I'm sure you know, is one of the world's great surfing destinations, and indeed in Namibia, on the Skeleton Coast, there's a world famous left-hander, which is probably considered to be one of the most difficult waves to get to in the world. It involves like flying to Windhoek. Is it Windhoek? I can never know how you pronounce that. And then driving across the desert for it's actually quite Burning Shore-esque, to say the truth.
I was going to say we've been there in Rolls books, haven't we?
Yeah, exactly. And it's a legitimate comparison, and there's there's a number of, it's still a real seam of surf culture that searching for that adventure. Because one of the things about surf culture these days, as it becomes more and more popular, is that it's getting increased. It's like anything. It's like it's getting more crowded. It's getting more popular. So to actually seek out, empty waves or that real spirit of adventure is, I think there's a direct parallel. I mean, people are surfing the Arctic, people are surfing the Antarctic, and that is driven by the same things, I would say, that drive a lot of the heroes and heroines in these books.
You've now put the image in my mind of Sontaine Courtney when her ship is sunk, rather than kind of coming ashore, kind of paddling on her raft. Actually, she kind of jumps on her surfboard, takes up a stance, and just kind of rides that wave right into the beach. But
well, I mean, the thought crossed my mind when I reread that passage, to be honest.
Yeah, if only missed opportunity. So the main thing we're here to talk about today is World War One in Wilbur's books, and it's an interesting, wasn't it? Because we associate Wilbur's writing very much with Africa, and I think in the popular imagination, Africa is seen as a bit of a sideshow, if people are even aware of it, as a sort of theatre of World War One. But in fact, there's a lot of World War One happens, and in some ways, kind of is forged in Africa. I was fascinated. The first British shot fired in World War One is actually fired in Togoland, long before anyone's actually shot anything off on the Western Front. And the hostilities in Africa don't actually end until 2 weeks after the armistice in Europe. So, in a very real way, the war does begin and end in Africa. And there's as Georgina said, there's 4 books of Wilbur's that sort of touch on the war. The one I wanted to start with was Assegai, because that takes place in the run-up to war. You've got Leon Courtney spying on the German industrialist Otto von Mirbach, who he thinks is up to no good, which of course he is up to no good. And it all revolves around a plot to try and foment an uprising in South Africa against British rule that will effectively knock out South Africa as a part of the British Empire and tie up British troops defending it. And like, as we sort of mentioned before, a lot of Wilbur stuff, this is actually based very much on real events.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I found, again, so fascinating revisiting these 4 books, because, of course, it is a theme of Assegai, but it's a prevalent theme, this question of South African nationalism. Obviously it begins at the beginning of the Courtney cycle, but then as you rightly say, like Assegai's pre-war, isn't it? And then it also goes through to Sparro Falls, like after the war, with the whole Rand Rebellion thing. That's that strand like going all the way through, isn't it? And I think, yeah, it clearly it was important to him, right, to like represent this aspect of African geopolitical history. I mean, Georgina, perhaps you could speak a bit more to that.
Definitely. I think there's a real sense of glamour kind of in war. Wilbur was born in 1933. He was too young to fight in the Second World War. This was post First World War, but he still felt the draw of the war's glamour. And that's until he learned the reality of it. There's a fantastic quote which I will read from his autobiography on Leopard Rock that says, as a teenager, war gripped me in its glamorous fist. It was a chance to test your mettle, answer the call of duty, to become a man. The price of military conflict was never in my reckoning. That was until I met our neighbour for the first time. And the neighbour had been a fighter pilot who was shot down, and I'm sure we'll come back to this when we talk about some of the air battles during the First World War, but this pilot was shot down in the Battle of Britain in the Second World War. So I think for the whole of Wilbur's life, war was this presence and something that he'd refer back to. And his books do feature African soldiers on the Western Front, but they also feature Westerners on the African continent on the run-up to the First World War and also during.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about South Africa is that, and it's easy to forget because I think in our minds the Boer War is a Victorian thing that's kind of old, and the First World War is a 20th century thing, which is sort of the dawn of the modern age in many ways. But actually, they're only 12 years apart from when one ends and the other begins. And certainly, if you're a South African, it's very, very fresh in the memory. And in fact, the whole generation of South African leadership, Botha and Smuts, were sort of very successful generals from the Boer War who are now in the government and have to make this decision whether they're going to side with Britain or whether they're going to side with Germany, who, of course, had been much more sympathetic to the Boer cause in the Boer War. So I find it fascinating that that these men who had like given their lives or dedicated their lives to fighting the British as hard as they possibly could around 1900, in 1914, they say, no, now we're going to ally with the Empire. It's an extraordinary turnaround.
Well, it's a real hard-headed decision when you read up on it, isn't it? By Berta, because, but then that actually leads to a huge advantage to the British Empire during the war, doesn't it? Because it means that not only can I think it's like 7 infantry battalions and 1 cavalry regiment that are in South Africa can then head to the Western Front, but then the experience that the South African leaders have had during the Boer War is a key factor in the East African campaign, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we often forget is that the generals on the Western Front who become kind of household names, sort of Kitchener or Haig or French, they didn't just spring into being on the Western Front. They'd actually all cut their teeth in the Boer War that the British generals were talking about.
Well, Churchill as well as a journalist, right?
Of course, yeah. And as you say, they do not seem to have learned a lot because sort of trench warfare is present in the Boer War, and there's battle after battle where the British discover that just marching straight at a bunch of people with machine guns and rapid repeating rifles who are dug into entrenchments doesn't work. You just suffer these horrendous casualties, and yet they 1914 they'd sort of try the same thing again.
Matt, I'm interested. What draws you to the First World War as a topic of interest? We've reached 110 years now since the outbreak of World War I. Are they timeless stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously you grow up as a British person, hearing a particular take on those stories, and then the more you look into it, the more that you realize how complicated and messy and it is. But I think insofar as the conversation we're having here and all the different themes that are tied up in it, I think that's where the fascination is, isn't it? If you look at, and also the romance, which is something that's really, I don't think should be understated. If you look at this, let's take the Burning Shore and the whole Royal Flying Corps episode, that is, and especially the way that Wilbur Smith tells it, an incredibly romantic story. And that is just the way that warfare is depicted. And when you're younger, that is quite beguiling, and as I was mentioned earlier, when I first started reading these books, that was the lens through which I looked at all this. It's only as I've got older and realized how many different strands there are that I've kind of become endlessly interested in it, really. And I think also it's worth saying that I didn't really have a clue about the East Africa campaign before we decided to do this podcast. We've obviously spent last couple of months researching and reading up on this, and I was aware of the themes that Tom mentioned around the South African kind of situation. And obviously I knew that we had colonies, and I knew that, the Italians were involved and the Germans were involved. But I really had no idea about this element of the First World War. It's like Tom was saying, it's just not very well known, is it, for whatever reason?
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think one of the interesting things about these 4 books that we're looking at is they all take it from slightly oblique angles.
Definitely.
None of it's kind of just like a sort of straight down the line what you'd expect from a kind of a war story. You mentioned the Royal Flying Corps, which is, I think, where I wanted to go next, because that's the opening of the Burning Shore, where Michael Courtney and his friend Andrew Killigrew, I think it is.
Lord Andrew Killigrew. Yeah, great character, isn't it?
Yeah. Are these 2 aces in the Royal Flying Corps in France on the eve of the Somme offensive. And one of the things reading that you are struck by when I went back and reread the book is just how new air power was, or it's so early. We don't even have an air force. It's not been named that yet. It's just called the Royal Flying Corps. And you get the sense of that it's, you know, every day they're discovering new things about how aerial combat can work and should work.
Yeah, and just to quickly run with that point a little bit, and not to move ahead too much, but it's a real feature of the Königsberg campaign as well, isn't it? The novelty of air warfare. You know, like if you, I think we read the same book, didn't we, Tip and Run, where they talk about that, and they're working it out on the fly, if you'll pardon the pun. You know, they're sending pilots over there. They don't know if it's going to work. Bit like, again, the Zeppelin stuff in Assegai, like it's all new technology. They don't have a clue whether it's going to work. And yeah, in the Burning Shore, you really get that sense of not only that, but the human impact of that as well, right? Like how far these extremely young men are being pushed, which is, I think, really well conveyed in the book. Because I think one of the things that is a slightly contentious storyline point, really, you know, like Michael's decision when Lord Andrew is killed to basically gladiatorially challenge somebody to single combat and spoiler alert, fall into a trap, and that's what leads to his death. And I read that and I was like, that is quite, why would you do that? But then I think when I reflected upon it, I was a bit like, well, the point is the strain, the emotional strain that these people are under. You know, they're not making rational decisions. Yeah. They're in this ridiculous environment where they've had no training. It's like you say, Tom, they don't know, there's no reference points. And you know, there's that detail, isn't there, where they basically get told all their missions are going to get like quadrupled, whatever it is, and they're all going to have to, and they're all like, well, that's it. So if you look at it from that line of it kind of does, it does tally really that, you know, ultimately the point is that these people are under an intense amount of strain, and no one really understands the impact it's going to have on them.
I think you hear as well, I can't remember the exact time frame, but in that sequence that Michael Courtney hasn't left the front line for, gosh, I want to say 6 months, but it could be far longer. And I think just that sheer consistency of putting yourself in danger every single day does create a kind of reckless bravery. Time will lose itself in a place like that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions I had for you, Georgina, was, I mean, you mentioned Wilbur was a pilot, and it's pretty clear revisiting these 4 novels, like how he venerates pilots, because any opportunity he's making his hero a pilot. You know, like in you know, and they all pick it up pretty quickly. Like, you know, like Leon is, you know, a couple of lessons, he's away. And then it's the same in Shout at the Devil, isn't it? And so, like, where did this fascination come from? You mentioned the neighbor that was formative with him, but like, was it just his, because he does really treat them in, as, you know, as cliche as it is, as knights of the air, doesn't he? This, like, all these things, these gladiatorial, like these people.
Definitely.
The technology is a huge part of it as well. Like this idea of like men mastering machines and in stressful environments. Like, where did that come from, that he made it such a feature of his oeuvre?
I think that's been something that must have been inherent the whole way through his life. Like I say, the glamour of being a pilot, but also his father. So he grew up on a ranch, and his father had a small Tiger Moth plane, and they used to go out in this plane flying across the ranch. So it was from a very young age that Wilbur was used to being in the air, and I think the sense of freedom that came with that must have stuck with him. So as a very young man, he learned to fly himself, and he was doing that for years and years, until he had a very hairy situation, and got buffeted, shall we say, probably too gentle a word, by the wind, which caused him to drop as he was coming into land at an airbase just north of Cape Town, I believe it was, one day. And the fear that gave him made him say that after this moment, I'm going to fly, but I won't fly myself. I will put myself in the hands of the pilots who do it every day, because if you're not doing it every day, you lose that dexterity. He was flying maybe once a month, which to most of us is very regularly, but to hone those instincts that you need, that we see Michael Courtney has in The Burning Shore. I think you need to be doing that on a daily basis. But he'd always had that fascination with flying. And we talked about his neighbour as well, and I think that shows through in his books, that he's pulled out historical events, historical figures, but also people from his life who have had such a impact on him growing up.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point you make, Matt. And I think, like a lot of things in Wilbur's writing, it does come back to his kind of relationship with his father, and who was clearly this kind of larger-than-life character. The other thing, of course, to remember is that Wilbur is named for Wilbur Wright, one of the Wright brothers, who invent powered flight. So it's pretty much from the moment of birth, I think he's kind of destined to have some
preordained.
Kind of, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, of course, the other flip side of it is that there's also a lot of historical truth in this. That I think airmen did see themselves as literally above the kind of the grubby business of soldiering. And in Burning Shore, Sontaine is very insistent that Michael, he's not a soldier, he's an airman. And this is a really important distinction for her.
And I think one of the details that I found most interesting from The Burning Shore is, and I would be really interested in knowing how truthful this is. Like, they have these motifs that identify them. Andrew's got this is like his scarf or something, isn't it?
Yeah, his green scarf.
Michael's got his distinct plane.
It's yellow. His plane's like bright yellow, isn't it?
He's yellow. Yeah.
And like you say, Tom, literally above the morass that's taking place below them. Like there's a kind of, I think glamour's the wrong word, but there's I think it's just really well conveyed, isn't it? That whole theme in that book, and ends in tragedy, as we know.
Yeah.
No, that scene I think really hit home with me, where Andrew is in his plane and we know that he is not going to make it. And like we said earlier, this is the first time that planes were really used in conflict of this scale. It was before the Royal Air Force was founded. They didn't have parachutes. Pilots did not have parachutes at this point in the war. So there's this scene where Andrew chooses, rather than to go up in flames with his plane, he jumps, and we see him falling, and we see that green scarf trailing behind him.
And I think the details are important, aren't they? That like not only did they not have parachutes, they didn't have adequate clothing.
No.
So there's the scene where Michael's getting dressed to go up and he's wearing 8 layers, and just so he can function, because obviously there's no oxygen. He's in a thin wooden and canvas plane at the end of the day. All the details about like the new pilots who were all basically getting the shits because of the smell of the air fuel. But this is the kind of reality, isn't it, of what these people were experiencing, which obviously Wilbur's like so good at conveying, like when it comes to this.
Yeah, and I think talking about Andrew's death, the fuel tank is on the front of his plane and it gets hit and bursts into flames. So as Georgina says, he'd rather jump out than burn to death. And it's a really neat example of how Wilbur takes these elements of his own personal experience, or secondhand experience, thankfully. So this is from the neighbour that Georgina was referencing earlier, that who had been a pilot, a Spitfire pilot, this is in the Second World War. And Wilbur writes, he knew he'd been hit. An ugly wheel of a hole gaped open in his port wing, and flames started belching from the bottom of the cockpit. The fuel tank on a Spitfire is between the instrument panel and the engine, so right in front of the pilot was 90 gallons of volatile fuel, and suddenly it went up like a bomb, flames shooting over his face and hands. Instinctively remembering his bailout procedure, he jettisoned his canopy, grabbed his Sutton harness to loosen it, and then managed to get out on the parachute, which obviously Andrew didn't have. But it's really interesting how he's taken a different event and a different type of aircraft from a different war and kind of repurposed it in this story. I think it's just a classic kind of way in which great writers sort of takes kind of the raw material of life and just kind of rework it to suit their own stories.
Well, he does it on grand themes as well, doesn't he? On the grandest scale. I mean, Assegai, that whole set piece is based upon if we're not jumping ahead too much, like a fairly ludicrous story from the war when you look into it.
Yeah. So for listeners who've maybe not read Asgard recently, we're talking about the other iconic aircraft of World War One, which is the Zeppelin, the great airships. And yeah, Matt, as you say, Assegai ends with this huge, very Wilbur-esque kind of set piece involving a Zeppelin and an aircraft flown by a Zeppelin with Otto von Meerbach, the evil German industrialist, and Leon Courtney going up against it in his little plane. And yeah, you think, well, that's insane. This idea that there's an airship over the middle of Africa, but as you say, it's actually not as insane as you think it is.
Yeah, I just assumed that was made up, and I was kind of like, because you think, well, that can't have been possible.
Yeah,
but it goes back to that theme that you alluded to, Georgina, about how, I mean, one of the kind of things about warfare is like, this is where technology gets tested, isn't it? When you can see that currently with the use of drones, for example, like, and these are the kind of technological frontiers, if you like, and it's we've alluded to this with the kind of examples we talked about from the First World War, and this is definitely another example of that. So yeah, I did a little bit of research. Yeah, so it's called the China Show, and essentially it was an attempt to resupply the Germans in Germany, East Africa by Zeppelin, and the plan was concocted to basically fly from Europe to where is the Makonde Plateau, and that was a distance of 3,500 miles, which obviously at the time had never even been thought about or conceptualized. And what's really striking when you look back at it is the fact that it was one guy's idea. It was just somebody in the German forces who thought, well, we could give that a go, because he spent some time in the theater and he'd seen the issues. They had a little dry run in the Baltic to see how they got on, see how long they could stay up in the air, and then they just thought, well, let's give it a go. And the reason it failed was because I think that they were going to fly over, at that point, British. The British had taken control of Sudan, maybe, or there was an area they couldn't fly over, so the captain decided to turn back.
I think they got a radio message saying that the British knew they were coming.
That's right, isn't it?
And they were ordered to turn back, and then
the British claimed it was espionage, didn't they?
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Right. Yeah. But there's I pulled a quote from Edward Pace, Tip and Run. And basically it said that the flight they did was 4,340 miles, so there and back. By the time the L-59 touched down at Jamboli, the crew were in a terrible condition, frozen to the core, exhausted. Some were in the grips of a fever. Others had chronic headaches caused by oxygen deprivation. As they set foot on land, everyone staggered as if they were still in the heaving gondolas of the airship. But the knowledge that L9 was the first dirigible to cross the Tropic of Cancer and had completed a record-breaking journey of 4,340 miles in 95 hours was scant consolation. I mean, just an incredible story. And you can see why Wilbur, presumably during his research, decided to base an entire book around it.
And again, for those who haven't read the book, it's fair to say that in a Wilbur book, they don't get a radio message to say, turn around and go back. And so they just turn around and go back. It ends rather more spectacularly.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the air. I think maybe we should move on to another one of the domains, which is the sea, which is not maybe as strong a feature of the books as these great kind of fighter pilots and Zeppelin missions, but it's very much there in a number of the books, and of course in Shout at the Devil, the climax revolves very much around an enormous ship.
It does.
Yeah.
I think, Matt, it would be really interesting to know from your side. The events in Shout at the Devil were inspired by, again, a real event. And that was a ship called the SS Königsberg, which is essentially disguised in Shout at the Devil as the Blücher. Could you just talk us through what happened with the SS Königsberg and how this might be the same or different?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, again, just a completely fascinating little episode in First World War history, really. And it does also tie together a lot of the themes, really, that we've been discussing. I think obviously the first thing to say is that in the First World War, the British Navy had parity, had precedence, shall we say? So they. The Germans were in a really tricky position, and in the German East African theatre, basically couldn't get resupplied, and there was blockade, and that on land kind of led to the way that they fought the campaign. But it did lead to these funny little incidents. One of which is the Königsberg, where it became this huge focal point, and it became this almost like empire versus guerrilla sort of approach on a smaller scale. So essentially, the Königsberg was considered to be a huge threat by the British, and was in the area, and it ended up hiding in the Rufiji Delta, I believe it's called, and the Germans did an incredible job of basically holding up in this delta and evading the Brits, which went on for a long time, and the British Navy essentially poured resources into this, and I think what's interesting with the way that Wilbur Smith has used this story is he's kind of more gone for the land campaign, really, and he's with Sebastian Oldsmith and Flynn O'Flynn, who are kind of co-opted into this campaign, aren't they, to try and destroy this ship. And when I was researching this, I'm pretty convinced that he must have been Flynn O'Flynn based upon somebody called Andreas Pretorius, who features in Tip and Run, and because obviously
who is Andreas?
Well, Andreas. So I'll read a little extract. Descended from the Boer War trucker Andreas Pretorius, he had achieved celebrity status in southern Africa as an elephant hunter and adventurer before finding himself on an island in the Rovuma River, the border between German and Portuguese East Africa, when news of the outbreak of war reached him. 3 resting months had ensued in which this intrepid Africa hand had escaped from the infamous Dr. Weck, the leader of the German patrol which had attacked the border post, despite his right leg being shattered by a bullet, been arrested by the Portuguese and escaped their clutches, trekked for a month to the safety of an English mission on Lake Nyassa. When he finally recovered from his ordeal, Pretorius then made his way to South Africa, where he soon received a summons from King Cole, who was the commander in charge of the attempt to get the Königsberg. So, there's more. He was a hunter. Mm-hmm. He'd had a wife that was killed. He had a grudge against the German colonial authorities. He was one of their most wanted. So you kind of think he must have been based upon that character, really. And he was the scout, essentially, who the British sent into the Delta to locate the Königsberg. And then when they decided to attack it from sea, which is the way they actually destroyed it, well, and air, actually, because they sent a couple of biplanes over as well, Pretorius was the one who essentially guided them in. So kind of the plot of the book, really.
It sounds like you put the Königsberg and you put Pretorius together. I mean, it's shout at the devil.
Yeah, and again, this tendency of Wilbur Smith that we're talking about to take these characters, personal experiences, incidents, and hugely romantic war stories, which the Königsberg is. I mean, when you look at the German campaign, the East African campaign, the Königsberg is the big set piece, really. It's the thing that's had the most written about. It's, and like I say, that it became a real symbol for the British, obviously. That this thorn in their side was, really close to them, and they felt they had to throw resources at it. Another really interesting detail as well is the fact that they did destroy it, but it was symbolic more than anything, because the Germans managed to take all the guns off. All the crew of the Königsberg ended up joining the land campaign, and they actually used all the guns to drag out the campaign against the British for quite a lot longer, it seems. So I think when you read into it, a lot of the Navy weren't hugely approving of how much resources had gone into this symbolic mission, really. But yeah, really, really interesting the way you use that tale. So yeah, like just to really, I think just to broaden it out, that seems to be one of the things you realize reading the history of this wider theatre of East Africa is there's a lot of quotes from people who had been on the Western Front and had also fought in Germany, East Africa, and in British East Africa, and it's just like, it was worse, it was harder, it was more punitive, it was more challenging, more punishing. The distances, the difficulties in resupplying, and just the elements, the heat, the dust. And I think that's what you can really see when you look at the Koningsberg and how long it took the Brits to actually, crack that problem.
Yeah.
A question I perhaps had for you, Georgina, as well, is like through the 4 books and through the whole, all Wilbur's work, he definitely seems to progress in the way that he conveys Africa and Africans. I think, like when you look at Shout at the Devil, I think we can say it's not aged that well in certain aspects. But then if you look at something like The Burning Shore and its depiction of the San Bush people who rescue Sontaine, it's pretty sympathetic, really. It's pretty sensitive the way that that's depicted. And that progression seems as much of a theme, an overarching theme through the books, as the geopolitical stuff, for example, that we mentioned earlier. It's something that's clearly important to him to convey. Is that something that comes across?
Yeah, definitely. I think you have to remember that the first book Wilbur ever published, When the Lion Feeds, was published in 1964. And he had a long career as an author. He had such a love for Africa, for Africa's peoples, for Africa's cultures, Africa's traditions. And I think that comes across in all of his books as he tells these different stories. I think, interestingly, out of these 4 that we're talking about here, Shout at the Devil is the one that sits tonally separate. And perhaps this was because it was that point in his writing career where he wanted to do something slightly different. There is humour in there, there's comedy, there is pomp and ceremony, but it's also incredibly brutal at points. And you go from this book that is, Flynn O'Flynn, larger than life, he's this rogue, and then Sebastian, who's quite a funny character. You wouldn't.
Yeah, he's like the comic foil almost,
exactly.
Isn't he?
He's not a traditional Wilbur Smith hero. None of
really
the characters
isn't.
in that book fulfill that role.
No.
And by the end of it, you've got this real kind of Wagnerian tragedy. It's a revenge story. It's a story of a vendetta. And it's just set, kind of the context is the First World War. To give kind of the backstory, the positioning of what was happening in Africa at that time.
Yeah, no, very, very much so. You mentioned Sparro Falls, which is the book we've probably spoken about least, which actually also, I think, has the least of World War I in it. It's, even though which surprised me when I read it the first time, because the jacket has the kind of classic certainly my edition has the classic World War I kind of Tommy silhouetted against a ridge. It doesn't actually have a poppy on it, but it might as well. It
looks like a Remembrance Day.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, you only get about the first, 30 pages or something in on the Western Front, and then we move very quickly and seamlessly to Africa. But again, those scenes on the Western Front are drawn very strongly, as you'd expect, and they particularly involve snipers, which was, again, finding a different way in. It's not just, again, kind of waves of Tommy's going over the top. It's a very specific angle on the on that sort of theatre of war that we know so well, or we think we know well. And again, once you start digging into it, you discover that there's a whole lot more to snipers than you thought there was.
Yeah, and I think the opening of Sparro Falls is one of the most memorable scenes of the cycle, really, isn't it? And yeah, I think it's really well done, isn't it? That first section, it's quite ahead of its time, isn't it? Because something like Stalingrad, the film, is clearly based around a similar plot, really. And in looking into this, I couldn't actually find any examples of this one-on-one sort of again gladiatorial battle between two snipers in the First World War. I think there's quite a few examples in the Second World War. So it does appear that perhaps Wilbur invented that whole scenario in that historical context.
I think Wilbur was very good at showing an appreciation for the skill of the enemy.
Sure. Yeah, he certainly does that in the Boer War novels, doesn't he? But I think also what's striking is how scared they are. You know, that the climactic hunt between the two snipers. You know, it's not glamorous. It's really made clear, like, that these are young men who are terrified. Really,
I think the First World War, trench warfare, particularly in the First World War, is so ingrained in our understanding of a place that causes trauma. And this opening section, to me, it is kind of masterful storytelling, because it's a sequence that tells us everything that we need to know about Mark, and as it shows his skill, it shows his resilience, but then it also shows the trauma that he's been through.
And it's so evocative and atmospheric, that section. I think that's why I think the first scene's so good, of you know, Sean and his assistant kind of walking through the trenches, and you know, it just conveys, doesn't it, the unpredictability and you know, the terror, the danger that are involved. But yeah, I mean, it seems like with a lot of the history of these things that we've been talking about as well, like the Germans seem to have been more prepared. If you look at the historical record, you know, the Brits were a bit slow when it came to appreciating the power of sniping as a weapon that they could utilize.
I think to start with, they didn't actually think it was possible. I think they thought that you couldn't get a rifle that accurate at that range, and it's only when the Germans start shooting them very precisely at long range that they start to think, oh, maybe there's something in this after all.
Yeah, and I found a quite interesting blog. There's a guy called Martin Pegler, I think he's called, who wrote a book called Sniping Rifles in World War One. And he basically says, while hunting was a distinguished and long-established tradition in Germany, in Britain it was the preserve of the upper classes and the rich. So only a few officers or men were available with the experience to provide the army with ideas as to how the sniping menace could be tackled. Fortunately, and there's the connection, there were enough men who had either been big game hunters or, more numerously, Bisley target shooters who were able to staff makeshift training camps to pass on as much information and skill as possible. So and that's Mark's background, isn't it? You know, Mark's grown up like hunting lions with his granddad, basically, and that's so that is kind of also historically accurate as a kind of detail.
The other detail that, again, I hadn't realized was accurate until I started reading up on it was they have this dummy in the trench, and they put its head above the parapet, and you get the sniper to shoot the dummy, and then you kind of track the muzzle flare, and then you can shoot back. And again, I thought, this is some clever idea that Wilbur's had and he's made up. But actually, that turns out to be exactly something that they used in the trenches in real life.
I also thought what was an interesting detail was how proprietorial Mark's, you know, it's a bit of a villainous kind of detail, isn't it? But his partner, you know, like how he's really trying to take the credit, and you know, there's that really funny dynamic
for his success,
where Sean kind of clocks it, and he's a bit like, yeah, you know, you're a glory hunter, basically. But again, that sense of, you know, partnership, and he clearly is depicted as a bit of a chippy working class lefty, you know, but clearly cares for Mark at that point, and clearly he's they're engaged together, aren't they? Which is also like an interesting detail.
I think Sean Courtney as well notes how good he is at his job with the dummy, the roll of the shoulders to make it feel like an actual soldier's gait.
Yeah, that's right. So we discussed Wilbur's sort of treatment of World War One on the air, at sea, and now on land. The other thing that struck me as we've been talking about these four books is how much of Wilbur's career they span. Shout at the Devil is 1968. Sparro Falls is 9 years later in 1977. The Burning Shore is 8 years after that in 1985, and Assegai then in 2009. So it's a theme he comes back to again and again and again, and it's really interesting the different ways he treats it, and the way he always finds different angles in these, certainly to us in Europe, very sort of little known aspects of it, but actually show how much of the war was either shaped or indeed fought in Africa. So Matt, thanks so much for joining us to dig into that. It's been an absolutely brilliant podcast. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
We will be back next time. Until then, it's goodbye from me, Tom Harper.
And goodbye from me, Georgina Brown.
That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne. Music by Dewey DeLay. Executive producer Niso Smith.